after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
I think that the first people who should read this book are our brothers and sisters in the United States, because their threat is in their own house. The devil is right at home. The devil himself is right in the house. And the devil came here yesterday. Yesterday, the devil came here. Right here. Right here. And it smells of sulfur still today. This table that I am now standing in front of. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, from this rostrum, the President of the United States, the gentleman to whom I refer as the devil, came here talking as if he owned the world. Truly, as the owner of the world. I think we could call a psychiatrist to analyze yesterday's statement made by the President of the United States. As the spokesman of imperialism, he came to share his nostrums to try to preserve the current pattern of domination, exploitation, and pillage of the peoples of the world.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic, roaming the digitosphere in the ever-expanding, ever-growing, ever-global TMBS universe. On this special Thursday edition of TMBS, we're also going to be doing Thursday next week as well, folks. We're talking about hands-off Venezuela, no support for any coup, but the broader problems and context to understand there. Bill Fletcher Jr., great writer, historian, labor activist, former president of Trans-Africa Forum. He's talking about the rising anti-austerity and labor protests taking place in both the Sudan and Zimbabwe under Emerson Mnangagwa, the role of the World Bank and IMF and autocracy in Africa, and these emergent movements. And we'll also touch on the legacy of Amilcar Cabral, the great African socialist independence leader. Lula da Silva, I've said it many times and I'll continue to say, is the world's most prominent political prisoner, and his obscene treatment this past week underlines it. We'll get to that, as well as new revelations that the mafia cartel that assassinated Marielle Franco is directly linked to the Wall Street-backed Bolsonaro government in Brazil. Troika of evil? United States, Brazil, and a right-wing Colombia under Duque? We shall see. Maybe, maybe not, but almost definitely yes. Shout out to the Davos disruptors. Bernie Sanders has an excellent estate tax bill, and we've got plenty to get to in the post-game, including my recent debate on Israeli television with quite the Mayo brain, and all sorts of other sound from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many, many others, as Howard Schultz fails and preens Fascism continues to rear its ugly head across the globe, and socialism surges in the Slav tracksuit. It's TMBS. Let's get to it. So, there is a coup attempt happening in Venezuela as we speak. It's been happening actually for decades. Going back to 2002, when there was an aborted U.S.-backed coup that saw a group of oligarchs and corrupt politicians connected to Venezuela's old political parties put Hugo Chavez in jail and put him in jail. Now, there was a mass uprising, and soldiers actually broke him out of prison, flew him back to the presidential palace, and the Bush administration and the New York Times, who endorsed the coup, were all left hugely embarrassed after that coup failed. Since then, there has been unremittent economic warfare on Venezuela, which is still, in fact, the United States is its biggest trading partner. So those sanctions, those mechanisms matter. And they've been intensified under the coup-hungry, unrepentant gangster Donald Trump government. There's no doubt about this. We oppose a coup in Venezuela, full stop. The United States has been essentially trying to bring Venezuela down in some form or another for decades. This Bolivarian government. John Bolton made it very obvious when he talked about the U.S. interest in oil in Venezuela. He is not hiding the ball. And while we can have and need to have a complex, full, detailed analysis, listen to the illicit history that I did with Ava Gollinger on the Bolivarian movement and revolution. There are real problems inside the Bolivarian government. Those that would tell you otherwise are not giving you a complete picture or being woefully naive or deluded. There's no doubt about it. And some of the reactions that Maduro has engaged in so far have in fact been cruel and abusive. Now, the reality is that when a superpower that happens to be your regional hegemon is trying to remove you from office and most likely assassinate you, this is not going to lead to the best governance decisions. But it is happening. However, Maduro has said he's willing to talk with Guaido. He's willing to engage with the diplomatic process being pushed by Mexico, Uruguay, and the Vatican. The only scenario which could avert a total catastrophe. And as I've said in many different contexts, including when dealing with leaders who have far more blood on their hands than anybody in Venezuela, there are never diplomatic solutions to any difficult situation that don't require people making peace with people who might have violated rights and norms. All that being said, there are still a lot of Venezuelans who back the Bolivarian movement, who are concerned that in a coup, even as there has been an economic crisis in Venezuela, a product of U.S. sanctions and harassment and of the failings of the Maduro government, that the gains, the redistributive policies that were implemented under Chavez and have continued to some degree under Maduro would be completely wiped away in a right-wing coup government. And they are right to suspect that. When you look at the report that came out several months ago that the United States was in negotiations with military officers about fomenting a coup in Venezuela, and you look at the makeup of this present right-wing effort under Guaido, who has been groomed by the United States, and the fact that this whole plan hinges on flipping the military, which they have not done, and another act of strategic miscalculation by the opposition, do you think for a second that the legitimate and real problems that plague Venezuela presently, corruption, connections with cartel trafficking, and indeed ongoing inequality and at times autocracy and abuse of rights would ever be improved by a U.S.-backed right-wing junta regime? A U.S.-backed right-wing junta regime who has been, Mike Pompeo put Elliot Abrams, the notorious butcher of Latin America, Ronald Reagan's point man on death squad governments and murderous Contras. You think these are the people that are going to solve Venezuela's problems? No. And we have some photos I want to get to, actually, of people demonstrating in support of Maduro and the Venezuelan government. This is from Venezuela Analysis, Venezuela Analysis, a website I definitely recommend people read. It's a needed perspective that you're not going to see in other media, and it is independent, but it has received funding in the past, I believe, from the Bolivarian government. And frankly, so You can certainly not get a complete perspective from them, but you're actually, in fact, also getting a profoundly skewed perspective from the New York Times and other Western media. There's a lot of people still on the streets supporting this government because they are scared that the far-right movement and U.S. imperialism will rob them of both their sovereignty and what they're still hanging on to of the gains of the Bolivarian movement. They need to be in our conversation as well. And let's also not forget, of course, that the United States, there was the bizarre drone attack that happened on Maduro several months ago. There have been reports of attempted coups for quite some time, as well as a broad U.S. history globally and particularly in Latin America of supporting dozens and dozens and dozens of coups, death squads, mass murder, and other abuses. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar gets it. She, of course, along with Ro Khanna, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Tulsi Gabbard, and Bernie Sanders, who, look, did I think it was the time to be overly critical of Maduro? No, but frankly, some contacts that I've had an ability to sort of hear from indirectly in the Venezuelan foreign ministry were quite happy with Bernie's statement because the bottom line was it was an opposition to a coup, which is what they're most concerned about right now. But Ilhan Omar has actually, credit to Ro Khanna for being first and credit for Ilhan Omar for the structure of her analysis. She tweeted this: "If we really want to support the Venezuelan people, we can lift the economic sanctions that are inflicting suffering on innocent families, making it harder for them to access food, medicines, and deepening the economic crisis. We should support dialogue, not a coup." There's really nothing else to add to that. We can relieve suffering by removing a coup, by stopping military instigation, removing sanctions. And we can and should push for and engage in a thorough-growing, broad-based diplomatic process that can move Venezuela in a better direction. And look, is the United States hypocritical and filled with double standards? This doesn't even begin to address, as an example, the fact that we are supporting on a daily basis mass murder and atrocities in Yemen, that our own body counts from air campaigns across the globe is astonishing. But let's just focus on Latin America for a second, and indeed go to the case of Lula da Silva. I have no doubt that there have been politically motivated imprisonings in Venezuela, but I also have no doubt that allowing an opposition leader to unconstitutionally, unilaterally declare himself president while you're making military threats and clearly hungry for oil is a significant problem. Contrast this with Brazil. Could you imagine if in Venezuela the situation had this added dimension? The most significant and successful president in Venezuela's history that had just served 2 wildly successful terms in office, lifting tens of millions of people out of poverty and eliminating hunger and gaining massive global stature for Venezuela, was put in jail by a vindictive, cruel prosecutor who proved his immorality by accepting an appointment from the present government, who had only gotten elected to office by imprisoning the former president, who was leading all opinion polls by double digits. What kind of meltdown would the United States have? What kind of hemming and hawing would U.S. media have about this? Well, of course, you don't hear anything about this with Lula. Not a peep from nearly anybody. A little from Bernie and a few other members. Frankly, most members of Congress need to do infinitely more for Brasilia and Lula. And at this point, it's shameful that people like AOC and Ilhan Omar haven't spoken about him, frankly, in my view. So that being said, we can observe the obvious contrasts, the obvious double standards, and we also can see that there's a clear path forward being advocated by people representing the Mexican and Uruguayan governments. We oppose coups, full stop. We oppose the Monroe Doctrine, full stop. And while we can get into the subtleties of this conversation, and nothing requires us to spin any particular perspective, and we can absorb criticisms of any government on earth, frankly, including the Venezuelan one, there is a fundamental position to have in a situation like it is now, with a far-right, belligerent, militaristic, rights-violating Trump regime continuing a bipartisan approach to attempt to instigate a coup and regime change in Venezuela. And that is simple. We oppose it. Full stop. Case closed. Hands off Venezuela. Period. All right, folks, we're actually running a bit behind. So what we're going to do actually, we'll just vamp for 1 second if you guys can. I need to send Bill Fletcher a text. Griscom, come on, you want to talk about this shit.
I mean, it's been pretty frustrating to see what's been going on in Washington D.C. especially. Just in the past week, there's been throughout all the think tanks, all these people are already preparing to come in to a new economically liberalized Venezuela to be able to pick up public resources and to take control of the oil. I mean, so people have been waiting for this opportunity for a long time, and it's not accidental. The events of the past few weeks, but seeing the support of people, in the United States is something that is very important. That we continue to push back against any kind of American coup, because that will be so devastating for the region if the United States is to get militarily involved in that area.
It's also interesting just to notice how the intellectual dark web, or the new right, whatever you want to call them, like Ben Shapiro, really thinking that this is a gotcha for a lot of people. Like when Ilhan initially tweeted out the first thing she said in sort of against the coup, Ben Shapiro jumped all over it saying, are you seriously going to defend Venezuela? And I think they actually aren't they're expecting that to be a weaker principle, and I mean probably for some good reason.
For a lot of people, it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's interesting to see how they're going to butt up against, like, Ilhan Omar's not backing down at all. She's only gotten more
she's been very principled
outspoken
on this.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's also just hilarious because what a nerd idiot category mistake that is. Like you frankly could have. I mean, I am a principled defender of Chavez in many key ways, and I think that there's something to be said for the Bolivarian Revolution. There's also a lot of very legitimate critiques, but frankly, you could be a complete opponent of the Bolivarian government and oppose a coup, full stop. Mm-hmm. So that's actually, even by his own logic, he's completely failing there. Okay, all right, guys. What we need to do actually is we're going to do a fuller pitch, but we're going to get to Bill Fletcher Jr. because I want to. He's in a bit of a. We need to get to him quickly. So I'll just say this really quickly. We'll do a more full one. 2,000 is our next Patreon goal. Get us there as quickly as possible. It's going to help sustain and expand what we do slightly. First and foremost, sustain. We're still dealing with YouTube. You got to help us on that. I think we'll figure it out, but it's very bizarre and it's very opaque. And as we've said, we've lapped them on their requirements. So first and foremost, become a patron at patreon.com/TMBS. Get 2-to-1 extra content, and that's the way everything happens. You can also give a one-off donation at our PayPal link to keep the YouTube thing going. I'm literally at this point, I don't know, but I would go and check. There might be a few more tickets left for the Bell House show. If you're a last minute and you're in town, you want to see us tomorrow night, our first live show. Bhaskar Sankara, Alona Minkowski, Trevor Beaulieu, Mike Racine. It's going to be amazing. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break and come right back with Bill Fletcher Jr. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is a mentor of our entire program. He is the past president of the Trans-Africa Forum. He is the author of The Man Who Fell from the Sky, which is a new mystery novel that we talked about a little bit last time. I am looking forward to read. And he's also the co-editor of Claim No Easy Victories, The Legacy of Amilcar Cabral. Bill Fletcher Jr. returns. Bill, thank you so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure, as always. I always enjoy your programs, and you're just really a great interviewer.
That's an honor to hear from you. So thank you very much, and you make it easy as an interviewee. I want to start by, we're going to do a little tour here. We're going from Zimbabwe to Sudan. There's a lot in the mix here. There's, I think, obviously first and foremost, what we attempt to do on the show, to the extent that's possible, is talk about politics and the terms of the country itself, whether it be, Zimbabwe, Russia, Brazil, or wherever. Then there's also the global patterns that we're concerned with, things like austerity, inequality, and so on, the rise of fascism. So there's that dynamic. Then there's also the broader dynamic of how and when do we cover particularly Africa, when it's these sort of poverty porn stories that pathologize African governments. There's a lot of attention when it's protests that implicate not only corrupt autocratic African leaders, but also the governing economic models that still emanate from the West, a little bit less so. So that brings us, let's start with Zimbabwe. There have been protests there that have been really aggressive the past couple of weeks, and a very aggressive government crackdown. Maybe explain, just really broadly, what is being protested there? And maybe as part of that, could you refresh us? We covered this when it happened, but maybe refresh us on the transition from Robert Mugabe to Emerson Mnangagwa.
I think you have to start with the question of where did Mugabe come from, in order to answer your question. So what's important for your listeners to appreciate is that there was a liberation struggle that went on in Zimbabwe against the white minority regime of Ian Smith when the country was called Rhodesia. There were two major liberation movements, the Zimbabwe African National Union and the Zimbabwe African People's Union. There was also an independent army that was called the Zimbabwean Independent People's Army, I believe. That was a third force for several years. Ultimately, the pressure from these forces brought about a negotiated settlement that ended white minority rule. It was called the Lancaster House Accords. And that was followed by an election in which Robert Mugabe's ZANU Popular Front came out on top. Now, ZANU and Mugabe had been associated with a sort of Marxist current within the National Liberation Movement, a different one than the ZAPU, and was really emphasizing national independence and economic development. And there were very important reforms that were introduced in the beginning of the administration of Mugabe. At the same time, there was repression of opponents, both within ZANU as well as externally. A lot of that was ignored by many of us on the outside, particularly those of us that had been supportive of the Zimbabwean revolution. There was some level, Michael, of denial. Mm-hmm. And we let that happen. So that's the background. Then what happens is Mugabe stays in power, and ultimately, by the end of the 80s and early 90s, begins to institute economic policies that were largely framed by the international financial institutions. This created a lot of unrest among the population, and the Trade Union Federation, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, which had been a part of ZANU-PF, separates, becomes an independent federation, and then finds itself in struggle with the economic policies of Mugabe. So that's sort of the background. Now, Mugabe ultimately is ousted for a variety of reasons, including that he basically antagonized pretty much everybody. It wasn't just antagonizing the West. He was antagonizing his own people and also antagonizing other elements of the Zimbabwean ruling class. And so he ends up being forced out. The new administration that comes in and is technically elected, and I say technically because there is significant controversy about the legitimacy of the election. Nevertheless, there was a willingness to give the new administration some latitude. The demonstrations that you were referring to were demonstrations that were sparked by a popular protest against fuel hikes. And then things exploded.
And so when we track this transition, and what's happening now, those two sort of themes. So first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of looking at Zimbabwe before for segments we did on it last year and in general was that not only in the 1980s were some on the left and some who were committed to liberation willing to overlook some of Mugabe's abuses, but that actually, and maybe this is a stretch, but I feel like there was almost like a certain type of Benazir Bhutto parallel for a minute, because it seemed like there was a time when he was both, because he was a liberation hero, a friend of the left, but that actually he was also embracing in the 80s a lot of sort of World Bank, IMF directions. So he's very, he's very polished. He's very urbane. So he did good BBC interviews. So he was also kind of embraced by the capitalist order as well. And so I want to get to the extent to like, what is the dual process there of Zimbabwe's economy coming apart? Because obviously the narrative here is this is, African or left or kleptocratic. And besides the racist narrative of African, I mean, kleptocratic is certainly true. But what extent was the implementation of what the World Bank and IMF wanted other part of this broader breakdown?
Well, that's a very astute observation that you're lending. That it was absolutely true that certainly in the 80s, that in the early 90s, that Mugabe was able to speak with forked tongue. He knew the language of Marxism. He knew the language of the left. He knew how to utilize it. We have many examples in our own country of leaders who were schooled within the left. They know the language. They know how to use it, but their politics have actually shifted. I'm not going to name names, but that is, it's not unusual, and that's exactly what was going on. What happens is Mugabe accepts the policies of structural adjustment, and at the same time, he had cut a deal with the white farmers to not move against them, and they were willing to support him, at least initially. There was a movement from the base that came from veterans of the Liberation War and others who were insistent that there needed to be land redistribution. Mugabe, when he was faced with a threat to his power, and the opposition, largely based in the labor movement initially, was really taking him on, all of a sudden he wrapped himself in the flag of Zimbabwean nationalism, embraced the veterans who were seeking land redistribution, and got ahead of it, claiming to be the leader of this. So he was someone that definitely spoke with forked tongue. The land redistribution needed to happen. The way that it happened, however, was very problematic, because the question was, who was going to benefit from the land redistribution. And this is where it's really important to have a class analysis and understand that the battles that have gone on around national liberation have not simply been battles for national freedom, but they've been battles for national freedom influenced by the classes that are operating within those national liberation movements. And so the class that Mugabe ends up representing was one that was interested in benefiting from land redistribution, benefiting from sovereignty, but they weren't talking about a thoroughgoing democratization of Zimbabwe. So that put that class that Mugabe represented against working people. And one of the problems in the United States is that many of us sitting on this side of the pond were transfixed by Mugabe's rhetoric and did not look at the concrete situation. And it was really funny because I went to Zimbabwe for a visit some years ago while Mugabe was the president. And one of the things that was fascinating was that, you know, the leaders of the trade union federation I was speaking to, they couldn't understand. Don't people understand who Mugabe is? That's what they kept asking me. It's like, why are African Americans entranced with this guy? Don't they see what's going on? And I tried to explain what the situation was, and I don't think I did it to their satisfaction. So when Mugabe ends up ultimately getting bounced, the new administration that emerges, as I was mentioning earlier, they got a pass, at least initially. But then the economic crisis, the issue of the real need to redistribute the wealth, etc., becomes a critical matter in Zimbabwe. And people start protesting. And that's when this massive repression comes down that was that stunned many people, because it wasn't just the brutality. It was like the internet was cut off. I mean, external communication was cut. It was an absolute attempt to smash an opposition that was not trying to overthrow the government.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll pivot to Sudan in a second. So is it almost? I know. I mean, Egypt had that interlude where the Muslim Brotherhood was elected in somewhat in open elections. But to me, it's like, does it kind of reflect Egypt, where there was a lot of energy around one specific, pretty broadly loathed figure who had, I mean, if I understand correctly, he even pissed people off on the level of essentially like bypassing people like an Emerson Mnangagwa, who was a very important player in both the liberation and also the oppression that you mentioned,
right?
And then to basically put his new wife ahead of them, so he got everybody was done with him, and then Mnangagwa comes in, but it's not a revolution or a big change because all the structure is still in place. It's just a personality shift.
That's right. It's not altogether different from the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos from the Philippines.
Okay.
And so what you end up having is not an ultimate crack or elimination of the regime. You have an elimination of certain individuals. And I think that that's one of the things that's becoming more apparent in Zimbabwe. And if you want to pivot to the Sudan, this is a challenge facing the Sudan, because in the midst of this popular uprising against the al-Bashir regime, one of the issues that is going to quickly emerge is whether al-Bashir will be replaced, but the regime itself will remain intact. That's the approach that the United States government, for example, has tried at different points. That was one of the things that they wanted to see happen in Syria. They wanted to get rid of Assad, but not get rid of Assadism.
Right.
And so you see these things. You saw it in Yemen with the end of the Saleh regime. And with not, Ali Saleh is ousted, but you don't have the end of the regime. So those questions haunt us when it comes to both Zimbabwe and the Sudan.
What's happening in the Sudan is I've seen a labor component. Definitely, we've played a clip of a very articulate, very young leader. But is this also on that same axis of, obviously you have a repressive government. It's a government that has gotten a lot of attention in the West for being repressive, but not a lot of attention for, again, following a very similar World Bank, IMF-driven formula and generating a lot of inequality and a lot of hardship for working people.
That's right. That's exactly right. To the extent that people know much about the al-Bashir regime, it's largely in connection with either the genocide in Darfur or the war that had gone on with what is now the South Sudan. But there was very little attention in the U.S. media about what was going on within the Sudan, within the regime of al-Bashir. Every so often there were certain things like, was al-Bashir, covertly supporting al-Qaeda, things like that. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing in this current uprising, which in some respects people have identified as like a continuation of the Arab Spring, is a popular challenge to a repressive, an authoritarian, a neoliberal regime. And al-Bashir's response, interestingly, is to play to ethnic divisions within the Sudan. And one of the things that is quite frightening is al-Bashir warning people that if he is ousted, the Darfuris will take over, which is a plea to what in a Sudanese context would be understood as a racial ethnic contradiction. And he's basically saying people that identify as Arab, which, Michael, could be a whole other discussion,
right,
that if they don't walk lockstep with him, that the indigenous African population of Darfur, most of whom are Muslims, will end up taking over and displacing them. So it's very ugly. But the opposition, at least so far, has not caved in. In fact, one of the interesting things I came across was a slogan from opposition rallies that in essence said, "We are all Darfur."
Mm. Wow. So what I find, it's depressing and horrible, but I'll be provocative. In a way, I like this analysis from Zimbabwe and Sudan because it brings two things to mind, and then we'll go to Amishal Cabral, who's the great contrast of all of this. But it seemed, one was Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonian philosopher, talking about how the age of humanism was over. He wrote that in 2016, and the sort of like flurry, he predicted before this wave of Trump and Bolsonaro, he really said, this is coming, this sort of fusion of authoritarianism and capitalism or neoliberalism. And what I think is fascinating about these dynamics in Africa, fusing like ethnic division with, neoliberal policies and authoritarian appeals, that would be part of a discourse several years ago that the sort of like, I have an Obama or Clinton poster on my wall and I want to go do some good in Africa kind of, benign imperialist colonialist attitude would say, oh, what a shame to see that there. Let's go over there and figure, and what really you see is like, the prototype of how to respond. First of all, that fusion and right-wing exploitation of that divisions are as old as right-wing politics. But in the specific modern context, what you're seeing prototyped in Sudan and Zimbabwe is what is happening in Hungary. the United States.
Yes.
I mean, it's different, obviously, but there is just a global pattern there. And this particular pathologies of places like al-Bashir are, they're not small relegated problems that you can pathologize or racialize. They're the roadmap of not dealing with capitalism that is coming to roost all across the Western and Southern hemispheric world.
So I generally agree with you, but I would nuance it a bit.
Please.
There is something that I would call neoliberal authoritarianism.
Right.
And then there is right-wing populism.
Right.
And so, and there is an overlap between these. I think that what we see in al-Bashir, what we see in Mnangagwa, in Zimbabwe, is charlatanism.
Mm-hmm.
Complete unmitigated opportunism and playing the different things, while advancing neoliberal politics. It's not what's different about that from what I'd call right-wing populism is actually an independent social movement that is regressive, is irrational, and is completely inconsistent. It's not, although it is opportunistic, it's not opportunistic in the sense of simply a manipulation by the ruling class. It's a movement that is a movement against the future. Yeah. And so what we see,
oh, bless you. Bless you, Bill. You all right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got a cold.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. What we see in places like the Sudan are repressive efforts in order to hold in place a particular ruling group. Mm-hmm. And they are manipulating, as frequently happens, ethnic, racial divisions. What we see in Europe, I mean, we saw it in Rwanda in its extreme form in '94. What we see in Europe is the spread of right-wing populist regimes and movements that are revolting, the right-wing nationalist revolts against globalization. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that they are very inconsistent. Some of them are openly embrace neoliberalism. Some of them oppose neoliberalism. At least they claim that they do. It's a whole mishmash. What we have to understand, progressives have to understand, is that we have a battle against both of these forces. And that battle has to be fought on the grounds of the extension of democracy, the fight for tolerance. And by tolerance, I don't mean just, Rodney Kingism and why can't we all get along, but I mean tolerance in the sense of tolerance of racial, ethnic differences that exist, and that exist in many of these former colonial countries that were manipulated by Europe. So we're looking at a very, very complicated situation, and so what we see in the Sudan is al-Bashir understands the way so-called race has been played to divide the Arabic populations from the indigenous African populations. He is using that in order to retain power.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's okay. No, I always appreciate those distinctions. And I think that, yeah, right. Because this is part of my job, I'll bumper sticker it. We have to fight Macron and Bolsonaro. And they're both,
yes.
Yeah, they're huge problems, but they're both different. And we both need a distinct left track from both of them. And I love the frame of really the deepening and widening of democracy, because I think that does actually do a really good job of enlarging the polity and dealing with difference, and then also the other and complementary track of democratizing the workplace and the economy so they can be synthesized and synergized. Yes. Okay. So one of the people that helped influence, I know, your thinking, and now through your thinking, mine, and I actually think part of the project here is actually just globalizing our sources, so that, you know, instead of saying like, oh, well, you know, I don't want to read the West or whatever, you say, well, first of all, is what you're calling West really West, and is East really East? I would question that to begin with. And secondly is, well, you want to be reading everybody. You want to be enlarging your capacity across the board. And Amilcar Cabral is one of the most important revolutionaries and thinkers that we have to draw from in the 20th century. So could you talk about him, who he was, where he was coming from, and why he resonated so much with you?
So it's Amilcar.
Cabral, excuse me.
Amilcar. And that's okay. And so he was Cape Verdean, and which is actually very interesting and ironic on multiple levels. But the Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau were sort of co-colonies of Portugal. Portugal had several African colonies: Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Vicente, I think it was called. There were a couple of islands, island areas that they also had, and and Cabral was an agronomist by training, and he, in the 1950s, along with other leaders from Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, as well as leaders from Mozambique and Angola, began discussions about a national liberation movement against the Portuguese. So he ultimately theorized and led in the development of what came to be known as the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verde Islands, PAIGC. That was the acronym in Portuguese. And he was ideologically a Marxist. He was but in his writings, it's not like he throws around a lot of quotes from Marx or Lenin or anyone else, but his methodology was Marxist. And he led in the building of this party, which ultimately in the early 60s turns towards armed struggle against the Portuguese, because the Portuguese repressed real opposition and peaceful opposition. So the PIGC starts gaining not only support domestically but internationally, and it gained independence in the aftermath of the Portuguese Revolution in 1974. But by that time, the PIGC controlled 2/3 to 3/4 of Guinea-Bissau. Now, Cabral was himself killed. He was assassinated in early 1973. And the circumstances of that murder have always been complicated and shrouded in some degree of mystery. But what it appears is that the Portuguese secret police, known as the PIDE by their acronym, conspired with dissidents within the PIGC, and they killed him. There may have been an attempt to kidnap him, but in either case, he was killed. And what the murder of Cabral, what many of us that were admirers of Cabral did not understand at the time. And actually, I saw Cabral speak in the United States shortly before he was murdered.
Oh, wow.
And he spoke at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. What many of us didn't understand were the racial/ethnic divisions within Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verde. And so one of the things that the Portuguese were playing to was some level of resentment that existed within Guinea-Bissau, which is on the mainland, against the Cape Verdeans. And the Cape Verdeans had demographically, they were, many parts of the Cape Verde were more racially mixed. And there was this sense that was promoted within Guinea-Bissau that the Cape Verdeans thought themselves superior. There was this tension that existed, and Cabral was murdered. The movement, however, was able to survive and ultimately went on to victory. But by the end of that decade, in the 1970s, there was a coup that resulted in the end of the unification of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. If you look, and now they're two separate countries. If you look at the works of Cabral, they were really remarkable in terms of grounding, in essence, a Marxist analysis in the concrete conditions of Africa. And he paid an immense amount of attention to culture. In fact, one of his most famous articles was about culture and national liberation. And he really emphasized essentially the importance of culture as a weapon, both in oppression but also in liberation. And that's one of the things for which he'll always be remembered.
I would like to do an illicit history for our patrons where we'll go through a much deeper dive on Cabral. But I want to have maybe introduce one concept in the last couple of minutes. And I'm going to contrast it with something just because it will help my thought process. And I could be completely off base here, but it was an interesting doorway for me. So Cabral talked about re-Africanization, if I recall correctly. And in this Marxist context you're talking about, where he's synthesizing decolonization with class analysis and dealing with ethnic divisions in this environment. And what struck me just on first seeing the term was I immediately went and I thought of the second president of a democratic South Africa, Thabo Mbeki's African Renaissance, which I actually, to me, in some ways was much more defensible than it was reported in Western media. There actually was a lot of ways in which Mbeki's thinking was not only justified, but I think it was important at that time, insofar as I could read it. But on the other hand, where the critique from people on the left also resonated with me was like essentially that Mbeki was putting forward a lot of neoliberal policies. He was deregulating. This was the 90s and early aughts where there really was a sense of this was literally the only way to govern. And so the synthesis of the sort of letting go of just even the social democratic legacy of the African National Congress would overlap with a different type of focus on quote-unquote cultural politics, which he sort of put his mind to. So, practically that meant like the cultivating of a black entrepreneur and business class in South Africa in a capitalist context. Contrast that approach with the synthesis of re-Africanization in Cabral's socialism. Or tell me if I'm totally off base in that comparison.
No, this is very interesting. And so if we could go for another hour, we could really dig into this.
Right.
This is what I would say, that what Cabral understood was that within culture, and the struggle for national liberation, there are class politics. There's class politics. It's not an abstraction, and so what he was saying, first of all, he used the term "return to the source," and he was basically saying that we African people needed to return to our own history. That colonialism had taken us out of history and had forced us into somebody else's history, and that national liberation was actually about the return to history, not in the sense of going into the past, but returning. It's the idea of self-determination. We're going to now follow through on our own history, where our history should have placed us. And this is a very, very important concept, because he was saying it's not like now that independence, for example, means adopting the culture and the politics of Portugal. It means figuring out within Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, where do we want to go as a people? And when Mbeki talked about an African Renaissance, at first it appeared that he was thinking along similar lines as Cabral, but I would argue that he wasn't, because he was talking at the cultural level, and all of that is true, and certainly Africa needs a Renaissance. But the question is, who stands to gain? Who is the Renaissance to be rooted among? Is it to be rooted among a small group of wealthy, of elite forces? Or is the Renaissance to be rooted among working people? Which takes us to Cabral's other notion of class suicide, where he talked about the petty bourgeoisie, what is sometimes thought of as a professional managerial strata, that they had a very, very important role to play in building the revolutionary movement, but their success, the success of the national liberation struggle, depended on this class abandoning its objectives as a class, which is very much related to what Frantz Fanon said many years prior to Cabral, that there's an aspiring middle strata within Africa that Fanon and later Cabral were saying, watch out, because this strata seeks to create a new capitalist class. They seek to create a new class that will, in fact, replace the European colonialists. They will look like the people at the base, but they will, in fact, also be oppressors. And therein lies the difference between a Cabral and an Mbeki, because Mbeki was not talking about any kind of class emancipation. He was talking about the replacement of, in the case of South Africa, a white minority elite with a black elite.
Right. So, in some sense, I mean, as much as in some ways, I mean, I think Mbeki's a fascinating figure, and there's a lot of problems with him, and I think some very important things about him. But in that frame, I guess Fanon and Cabral were actually warning us in advance of Mbeki's project. It would be one way of reading it.
That's exactly right.
Bill Fletcher Jr., I just appreciate your time immensely as always. We'll hopefully do an illicit history soon of Cabral. I will have the name down 100% at that point, I promise. And maybe sometime also you could come in studio in New York. We would love to have you.
I'd love to be there. And no, absolutely. And I love your program. I'm hoping that your listeners make the contributions financially to keep you going, because you occupy a very, very important niche, and I want to make sure you continue to do so.
Bill, I'm really honored by that. Man Who Fell from the Sky. It's a fascinating mystery novel. Read it. Bill Fletcher Jr., follow all of his work on his website and on Twitter. Bill, go kill that cold and have a fun evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you
take
so
care.
much. Take care. That guy is amazing.
Yeah, I always
That's usually why I do pre-records with him, because after a couple minutes talking to him, I get that download. I'm just like, yeah, Bill Fletcher Jr. is really fucking smart.
I always think it's like good that he doesn't have his own podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's the food futurist. Like, hey, so Michael, I'm thinking of getting into podcasts. Oh no, no. Yeah, it's totally not worth it.
Leave that to us.
Don't lower yourself, bro. You're an important historian and activist. You got to make dick jokes, do impersonations. Imagine Bill Fletcher Jr. drops a podcast and all of a sudden just like also busts out like a great Trump impression. Just like, fuck.
I bet he's got one.
Oh, I bet he does too. But that might be a testament to how much Trump has literally rotted all of our brains. That asshole has made us all have an impression of him.
Yeah.
I really do think though, like if I had my druthers, there's a lot of people, but I specifically, the logistics actually are really complicated. But if it was just like a magic wand situation, or honestly, and this is not at the 2,000 patron level, but like as we grow, when I talk about like expanding, the type of thing that I would have in mind, and I'll finally get what I'm saying. Like I actually think it's insane that specifically Bill Fletcher Jr. and Milton Alamati should have podcasts that get a massive amount of listens. Like the body of knowledge you're talking about there and range, and then just ability to communicate it.
Seriously?
That's the other thing. You do meet people who are as smart as Bill Fletcher Jr. in certain like academic contexts or whatever, but they can't do that interview.
No, definitely not.
They're not articulate like that. It's unbelievable. I don't know. I just admire the hell out of the guy. It's
communication and communism share a root for a reason.
Indeed. Yeah, guy. I mean, I'll say it again, guys. We do need you to become a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. Tomorrow, on the 1st of the month, we're going to have to figure out. I mean, Patreon is a nightmare with declines and all of this and that. And I'm realizing now sometimes, at first I thought it was like, you have to figure it out, and I'm sorry it's a hassle. But now I've been getting messages like in the last round where it's like, I'm putting it in for my 4th try, and Patreon still got a this and that. I think it might actually be because I think Patreon, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It's something to do with their banking.
They moved banks.
I think
to
they
a different
moved
country,
overseas.
So then it comes up as a fraudulent charge.
I think that's what it is.
And they didn't tell anybody.
Well, they told everybody after the fact. Yeah. So that was not impeccable timing. But
it's always good when a company like has to update people on where the money is.
Right.
Oh, by the way, the money's going to someplace
like
entirely
heads up,
different.
Like, yeah, right. What you buy your food and pay your rent with, it's another place.
It's about 6,000 miles away from the last place we said it was. We'll keep you posted, though.
Yeah, right. People like who your livelihood depends on, it might look like they're trying to buy ecstasy on the black market. So we'll figure it out. But anyways, make sure all of your stuff is good and in order. And within the next couple of weeks in February, it shouldn't. I mean, I think we'll probably actually go well past it, to be honest. But let's hit that 2,000 goal and sustain it and keep everything going. Give it a try. There might be a few more tickets for the live show tomorrow night. We're excited. We're gonna have a great time. It's gonna be amazing. I liked how. Maybe we'll play that later. But I liked how Griscom tweeted out the video of Bernie in the Svits singing what was the song? This Land Is Your Land.
This Land Is Your Land.
Yeah, and he said, "This is funny that this should leak before our live show," as a foreshadowing of the ethos of the TMBS live show.
I have a feeling it's not going to be too different.
No, not at all. All right, let's get to the shout out.
Let's get to the shout out. Shout out. Creepy.
Shout
out. Weird.
I think that's creepy.
It's incredible. Shout out.
Why is Alex Jones so fucking funny?
Shout out. This is Alex.
Really is
I
funny.
really miss him.
I kind of miss him too. That really is though a testament to such profound cynicism. Right.
I know. I realized it as soon as I said it that some people get so mad at me for my love of Alex Jones. I get it. He's a bad guy, but
Oh,
he's
my
a
God.
character. Man.
Yeah, don't get mad about that. That's a little ridiculous.
Somebody was upset that we haven't been updating as much on Alex Jones.
He's not in the game,
But
guys.
like, for instance, there's some stuff with the Sandy Hill lawsuit, I believe.
Sandy Hook.
Sandy Hook, sorry.
I think they got rights to his documents.
Yeah, got to go into discovery. That's all good. But the main reason we were covering him was, well, number one, it was good YouTube content, but also number two, he was on YouTube and he was like be a public sort of figure. I mean, if he does something amazing, we'll play it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, guys, ironically, one of the reasons that we're not like a pure entertainment channel, like at all, like even the bullshit that we do still should have some overlap with like the discourse. So, you know, there's some people like, yeah, there was a time where Alex Jones puts out these hilarious, hysterical, and horrific videos, and Donald Trump is on his show, and he's one of the indisputed kings of new media. It's not the case anymore. Bless you. Davos happened. Davos is a confab. I believe it started in the early 1990s, where the elites meet to coordinate policy, where Tim Cook takes a picture with Jair Bolsonaro. It's emblematic of all of the problems of our world. A very specific, I mean, maybe not all, because it is definitely more of the, what Bill Fletcher Jr. would say, the authoritarian neoliberal than the right-wing populism. And I have no doubt smart and interesting people have always been invited to Davos, but this is actually a positive democratizing effect of social media. If you were at Davos several years ago, one, the context is different. You're not coming off of all of these mass movements and the Sanders campaign and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so you're operating in a different global political context.
Do you remember what Davos was like after the recession?
There was a little bit, if I recall, it was more liberally. It was a little bit of like we need to have like a panel about, got to help people out a little bit. And for what it's worth, like, Davos is a pretty third way event. It wasn't like, these are not people that are, I'm sure there's fascists, everybody's there, but it isn't like, the ethos would be much more of like it's pure 1990s. So there's some room for like tiny social safety nets, but certainly not like democratizing the economy. And they always had people there who would, were supposed to provide some intellectual heft. But, if you're in a room of billionaires and heads of state and pop stars, you're probably, first of all, you're less likely to challenge it if it just stays in the room and on some boring C-SPAN live stream. You can go into the archives. It's unbelievable looking. It's like Bill Gates, Thabo Mbeki, and Bono talk about African debt type of stuff. But now the political environment we're in is very different thanks to those forces, material and political, that I mentioned before. And social media makes your calculus of how you use these events radically different. So Anand Giridharadas exposed it's hard. The idea of exposing Bill Gates and Tony Blair is kind of hilarious. Everybody should know what they are, but he did, in fact, piss them off, and they threw their little tantrums. And then this thing happened on taxes with what's his name again?
Rutger Bregman.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
That was the other panel. Was the Michael Dell got a question from an economics reporter from the Washington Post who was so illiterate on economics that she apparently, and I still say apparently because I actually can have a hard time conceiving that she could be this ill-equipped for her job. She apparently thought that there were progressive tax rates in the 1980s. when Ronald Reagan was literally slashing them down to, I think, 28%. I think Bill Clinton knocked that back up to about 30% or 32%. So you had an economic illiterate ask an oligarch if he should buy into AOC's eminently reasonable and moderate 70% after $10 million of income proposal. He said, that would never work. And then a professor from MIT did the Marshall McLuhan moment in the Woody Allen movie, where Marshall McLuhan steps out from behind the poster and is like, I actually am Marshall McLuhan. You've completely misinterpreted my work. And he did one place it worked was the United States. And of course, we wanted to add a little Bernie flair to it. We could say, right now in Denmark and Sweden, there's high tax rates. So that was the one moment. And it was mostly, there was a lot of value in Michael Dell looking like a jackass.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes. We need to, just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name? Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. This is not rocket science. We can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more.
That's the best part.
Come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Well, of course, that's 100% right. I don't know if let's play this on. So, eminently sensible, eminently obvious, it's beautiful, but it's depressing because this stuff should be like, this should have been solved like hundreds of years ago. But anyways, of course, this led to a tantrum from a resident oligarch, a former CFO of Yahoo. What's this guy's name? I think he identifies himself, but I know he's a former CFO of Yahoo. And
it's Ken Goldman.
Well, Ken Goldman has got some whining to do.
Honestly, this is a very one-sided panel. The U.S. basically has the lowest unemployment rate ever, the lowest black unemployment rate ever, the lowest youth unemployment ever. We've actually reduced poverty around the world. No one's talking about that at all. I'd like the panel to talk about beyond taxes, which every one of you have talked about. The only thing you've talked about in this whole panel on inequality, what can we really do to help solve inequality over time beyond taxes?
The gentleman who talked about...
This is Winnie Byanyima, and she's I'm apologizing the last name. She's Ugandan. I believe she's a former aeronautical engineer, and she is the Oxfam International Executive Director who puts out those inequality reports. So she's one of like a handful of excellent people at this forum, and she's going to very politely and with a lot more class than we would put this jackass in his place.
Make him the chief officer of getting owned.
Yeah, exactly.
Taxes.
The gentleman who said we've just talked taxes and that jobs are there and there's low and unemployment rates are low. Let me tell you something. We're talking about jobs, but the quality of those jobs. And we also work with poultry workers in the richest country in the world, the United States. Poultry workers. These are women who are cutting the chickens and packing them, and we buy them in the supermarkets. Dolores, one woman we work with there, told us that she and her co-workers have to wear diapers to work because they are not allowed toilet breaks. This is in the richest country in the world. That's not a dignified job. Those are the jobs we are being told about, that globalization is bringing jobs. The quality of the jobs matter. It matters. These are not jobs of dignity. In many countries, workers no longer have a voice. They are not allowed to unionize. They are not allowed to negotiate for salaries. So we're talking about jobs, but jobs that bring dignity. We are talking about healthcare. The World Bank has told us that 3.4 billion people who earn $5.5 a day are on the verge, are just a medical bill away from sinking into poverty. They don't have health care. They are just a crop failure away from sinking back into poverty. They have no crop insurance. So don't tell me about low levels of unemployment. You are counting the wrong things. You're not counting dignity of people. You're counting exploited people.
I have nothing to add to that other than potentially some impression of that guy being like, bitch.
Yeah, get some, Goldman.
You know,
yeah.
It's just an interesting tidbit for somebody.
That was fucking beautiful.
An asshole like that CFO is to talk about a group of people that have very much developed over the past 20, 30 years. You look at the American economy, and the CFO position was actually very rare for companies for most of American history. It's only in the 90s and like 2000s when it expands. And what do you see there? You see a contraction of wages for workers. You see more and more companies being involved in 10, 100, 1,000 subsidiaries, very confusing relationships.
Managing the new bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Managing
so when we're
the bureaucracy
talking about
neoliberalism.
Exactly. So when we're talking about this, that's why this guy is so worried about people challenging the status quo.
Yeah,
over the past 30
he's
years.
a over-glorified paper shuffler whose very function is a symbolization of all of the problems of our time. Yeah. And he's whining. And I have to say, even archetypally, there is something hilarious about getting and I don't like the left anti-American shit, so I avoid it. But there is something hysterical about whiny American oligarch gets co-owned by Ugandan Oxfam executive director and unassuming Scandinavian academic. There's something hilarious just about the ecosystem of that co-ownage.
I think they have no idea how to behave anymore either.
No.
He was not expecting that woman to say you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
No, he was expecting no, that's exactly it, because he was expecting her to and I think that this would very recently potentially be the case. All right, well, this guy's an asshole. He has no idea what he's talking about, but I'm at Davos. What about donors? What about, oh man, how do I do it? Versus just dude, people in the United States working for Purdue are wearing diapers. What the fuck are you talking about, you spoiled brat? Shut the fuck up. Fuck you. And I think that next week, this weekend, the illicit history is going to be with brilliant Nigerian British writer Ralph Leonard, using CLR James to critique identity politics and talk about economics, but actually as a doorway for this sort of the positive globalization project that I'm committed to, and that is actually going to be forming a major part of the answer to this IDW garbage in my book. But next week I'm doing illicit history with Zach Carter on the 1990s, and it's and it will be a compliment to the Third Way illicit history, and it's he just wrote this great column, being Howard Schultz's whole campaign and all of these guys is just this whiny, plaintive call to go back to 1995, when just their raw selfishness and self-interest was just the received wisdom of the day. And they don't know how to behave, and they don't know how to answer anything because they literally don't know anything. I mean, I think I'm quite sure that Michael Dell actually didn't know the Eisenhower tax rates, let alone not being able to have an answer for it. He didn't know that shit.
Just like Howard Schultz didn't know why it's incongruous that he would cite FDR as his favorite Democratic president.
Right.
They have no idea what the fuck they're talking about.
No idea what the fuck they're talking about. And that's why they just latch onto these cliches. And it's also beautiful. I mean, this is another, by the way, an impact of having a real left presence too, because it's look, in a relative political fight, I get it is important to say Obama stopped the bleeding from Bush and added this amount of jobs. You need to say that in a 2012 reelect campaign. No doubt. But when you have a left political presence, we can come along and say, actually, if anything, people work way too much. And what about the quality of those jobs? And what about people having power over their economic lives? Those stats mean very little, and they never mean what those people think they mean. And speaking of that, let's get to the segment that keeps Richard Wolff from becoming a patron. The David Griscom Economic Minute. Yeah, it's pretty intense. You see how much I do for you? Griscom Economic Minute. Go for it.
I just talk about another group of vultures. So we were talking about Venezuela earlier, and I just want to add a little bit of context to what's been going on, especially a sort of underreported, misunderstood story. So in addition to Trump's state policy of to the victor goes the oils, debt traders have been very giddy over the past month as Venezuela, is going through all of this pain. Specifically major funds that own Venezuelan debt. And just to give you some of the numbers behind that, Venezuelan government bonds have actually jumped 23 cents on the dollar from earlier this month to now 33 cents this Monday. Bonds on the oil company, PDVSA, went up from 14 cents to 24 cents. So it's sort of wild to think about a country like Venezuela, which is going, under like increased turmoil over this past month, why the market would be so giddy about it. Well, obviously, it's because they're very much hoping for a U.S.-backed coup that is able to come into power. Some of the major firms that are pulling in money, Stone Harbor's Emerging Market Debt Fund.
That should be illegal by name.
Oh man, I shouldn't have even tripped up on that one.
You know what we
got
should
some
do?
Better ones coming.
Sorry to butt in here, but we should do a game where we make up a few of these and try to guess which ones are real.
Oh, definitely. All right, make a note of that, because that is definitely. Let's do that for post game next week.
Well, that $1.2 billion firm is up 5.9% this month. $6 billion firm, the T. Rowe Price Emerging Markets Bond Fund, is up 5.4%. BlackRock, which we all might know, which is $2.7 billion in their emerging market bond fund, they're up 5.2%. The biggest winner, though, is Goldman Sachs. And right now I'm quoting from the Financial Times. The $8.2 billion Goldman Sachs emerging market debt portfolio is up by 4.8% this January, while the $1.9 billion Goldman Sachs emerging market debt fund has gained 5.1%. Now, it's important to recognize that while all these people are coming in on Venezuelan debt right now, Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, is not able to restructure the debt that they have. And it's been getting much worse because they're unable to get U.S. currency. And the currency reserves of Venezuela have dropped very, very low recently. We're talking about the last that I checked, something around 9.7 billion, and that was back in 2017, so at the very beginning of the Trump sanctions, which is meaning that they're more and more having to rely on gold to be able to match their debts. So there's basically, this crisis that's been created by U.S. sanctions and, by issues with monetary policy within Venezuela, which now people are coming in to take advantage of. And I just wanted to take a quick second just to explain, a little bit about why there's this currency crisis in Venezuela and sort of what this black market situation is. So after the United States tried to attempt another coup back in 2002 against Chavez, there was a very swift capital flight. And what that means is basically people who have money and assets in Venezuela are trying to take those out and put them into the U.S., right? But primarily people buy U.S. dollars because it's the most secure currency. So to prevent Venezuela bleeding off all of its wealth, they tried to create, currency controls, and they tried to buy their own currency to inflate, to maintain the price. Well, that didn't work because they were basically spending so much money trying to maintain the price that they created a fixed exchange rate, and they put limits on, how you could use Venezuelan currency to buy U.S. dollars. It's very strict, primarily just if you were traveling or if you were importing goods. Now, the importing goods becomes very important because basically what happened is you had an exchange rate that was very cheap to buy goods and import into Venezuela. That was much cheaper than what became the black market. Now, a bunch of people who had access to these markets were basically buying goods, selling them on the black market for very cheap rates, and then taking all this money that they had, the Venezuelan money, which basically was inflating the price within Venezuela, which created basically a two-tiered system for the economy. And, right now, that's how you have this very low fixed exchange rate where the government is pretty much unable to buy imported goods on the fixed exchange rate because the black market is so much more profitable for people who are importing.
Right.
And it's created a lot of significant issues for the Maduro regime, especially once the price of oil dropped And once the price of oil dropped, you basically lost a lot of revenue, which is only going to get worse with U.S. sanctions, which also make the debt crisis worse for Venezuela, which also make it more difficult for Venezuela to be able to raise their own funds to have a functioning economy. So, you got to understand that within the Venezuelan system, there have been mistakes by the government, but there is an economic war that is basically pushing the inflation rate so high.
They're not letting
that it's
Venezuela pull out money from their own bank accounts.
Exactly. So, and basically, Venezuela doesn't have any foreign currency reserves anymore,
right?
Which have all been
being
exhausted.
stolen.
And now all the gold that they have elsewhere is now being seized. And now the United States is saying that the opposition leader, has access to all the U.S. Controlled assets. So
it's an attempted coup. And again, I just reiterate, there's no room for any nerding or pedantry about this. You need to oppose a U.S. coup. Do we have a full analysis? Are we blind to failings of Maduro? Of course not. Can you have a full-scale assessment? 100%. But there's a fundamental position here. That is no coup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an attempted coup, and it's one of those things where you had a group of people in Venezuela who immediately, when Chavez came into power, were trying to undermine that system with the help of the United States. And when the United States has this incredible financial power, being the world's reserve currency, it's really going to create a lot of problem for any kind of left-wing, government, even left-leaning government.
Of course. Well, we see that. We're going to get to Lula's in a second. I mean, look, I think it was in 2004, maybe 2006, but I mean, Chavez got the power in the late 90s. And in the first year or two, I mean, he was actually he even mentioned the third way himself. He was very cautious in his movements. Now, Venezuela's oil had already been made public in the 70s, I believe, well before Chavez. He didn't make the oil public. What he did was he promised to distribute the benefits of the oil to the population, so it wasn't just in a sort of crony capitalist network as it was under the old parties. And, basically there was a period after 2002 where they were flush with the oil, international prices were high, and he just started seriously investing money in people and creating a great social safety net. And he accomplished all sorts of social gains in Venezuela, which were respected and admired by everybody that cares about those things. And he also moved in more aggressive and interesting directions with fascinating and mixed results, essentially having to do with, in my read of it, almost depending on where it was. Like, he started these participatory democracy projects, and some of them were amazing and effective, and others were corrupt and failed. It had to do essentially with the makeup of the people on the ground implementing them. And then, but by this time, I mean, the Bush administration is instigating a coup. There's sanctions are being put into place. Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, which is a prominent Democratic consulting firm that's done a lot of work for people like Gonit Sanchez de Lozada, who had to flee after basically having protesters killed, which was the guy in power before Evo Morales won in Bolivia. By the way, Bolivia is still with incredible economic growth and still governed in a populist left orientation under Evo Morales. So Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner came in to work for the opposition, and Chavez was unbelievably popular. And things have took a turn for a variety of reasons, including oil prices, including sanctions, including the failures of the government. But again, that's the context. But no coup. And also the other context that never gets mentioned here is there's a huge organic. There is not the forces of Guaido or Western American manufactured. There's definitely people on the street and definitely real people who are fed up with Maduro 100%. But as you saw in that Venezuela analysis, there's plenty of people still marching for the government. And it's simply because of, one, sovereignty, which is why the military hasn't defected so far. And two, because even for all of the crisis and failings that they're in, as I say, there have been some gains that would almost certainly be eliminated in a U.S.-backed right-wing government, and people are aware of that.
But it's and the thing is, when it comes to mistakes of the government too, imagine if during the financial crisis of the United States, right, you had a foreign power that was basically stress testing the entire American economy, right? And that's basically what has been going on over the past 5 years in Venezuela.
Yep. Yeah, there's no doubt.
You have an
No doubt.
inflationary crisis, and then you match it with sanctions, and you start pushing with the oil prices.
Yeah, and
it's
you
gonna
also
affect
fund
them.
other groups. You
Yeah, and of
fund
course, that kind of
military insurgencies. You have threats from right-wing government in Colombia. 100%. No doubt about that. You need to oppose this coup. All right, we're going to go to the post game in a minute. I want to say again, definitely. Well, I'll just say, like, we spiked. We had an excellent month. In the last couple of weeks, it's just stalled. Not stalled, actually. No, we're still growing. But I want to get back up to that fast rate so we can get past that 2,000. And then in the horizon, 2,000 and at 2,000 patrons and above, that's really just us being like sustained and settled, and getting and allowing us to ongoing like deal with the YouTube situation, things like that. When we get past 3,000 patrons, that is potentially where we do start figuring out like, oh, is there a way for like a different type of collaboration with a Bill Fletcher Jr. or a Lona Minkowski? I have no idea. I'm just putting you a little bit in our thought process. You'll know more if you become a patron. We shall see. So patreon.com/TMBS. Got to get to Brazil. Next week, which we will also have another Thursday show because the Majority Report team is doing live coverage of Trump's State of the Union. So obviously we'll respond to what the fucking idiot says. But we'll also go into depth on a story that is fast moving and emerging from Brazil, which is basically actual serious corruption allegations swirling around the Bolsonaro family, money laundering, direct deposits to Bolsonaro's son, and a paper trail that actually connects him to the Bolsonaro son, and by extension the Bolsonaro political operation itself. His son's also a politician, to the murder for hire paramilitary gang that assassinated Marielle Franco. So this shouldn't surprise anybody, but just to be clear, within a matter of literally weeks, a fascist government that received all of the backing of the Brazilian capitalist classes, the backing of the Wall Street Journal, the backing of Western capital interests in the United States and Canada in particular, that flew out of a judicial coup against Dilma Rousseff, a lawfare campaign that was backed by the Clinton State Department, the Obama Justice Department, to criminalize the Workers' Party, has led to a government that not only just in the overt sense everybody should have opposed because of clear-cutting the Amazon and, the first openly gay legislator had to flee the country this past week because of the violent homophobia of this government. I believe his spot is actually going to be taken up by David Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's husband. So, it shouldn't surprise anybody, but the relentlessness of this criminality and this viciousness and the support of it by U.S. capital interests is grotesque. And there's been some words. There needs to be a lot more from elected leaders here on the indigenous people's crisis there, on the LGBTQ community there, on how corporate interests are facilitating what's happening there. And it's an umbrella for a broader conversation, because the more I look into this, I really would say that when the Obama administration chose to sign off on the 2009 Honduras coup that removed Manuel Zelaya from power, that was an essential turning point. And of course, when you throw the keys like that to somebody like Trump and Pompeo, the thuggery will know absolutely no limits. And Bolsonaro is, just some of the just gangster government. This past week, Lula da Silva, who, as we always say, was hounded by a vicious, cruel, far-right prosecutor, Sergio Moro, who Notre Dame gave an award to. Now, immediately after barring Lula from a presidential race he almost certainly would have won, took up a job as justice minister in this fascist government. That speaks for itself. He convicted Lula without any material evidence and literally sentenced him to the term was indeterminate acts. And this is a country where, again, we've talked about this a lot, but politicians stay out of jail on multiple appeals. The court system is incredibly slow. This prosecution with zero material evidence was fast-tracked to put the most important and popular and significant politician in the country in jail, where he has been held in isolation, not allowed to speak to the public, and was barred from running for a race that every poll showed he led by double digits. This is a massive global travesty. This is, as Noam Chomsky says, this is objectively the most prominent political prisoner in the world. And any new charges and any new thing that you hear coming from this Bolsonaro government and this thug, Sergio Moro, is a lie, or at the very least, totally untrustworthy. Because this government's practice of lawfare with the backing of the United States and the regime in power now, and the way the Supreme Court has acted, belies any trust in anything they ever say about Lula. And this was really cruelly and viciously illustrated this past week. Lula's older brother, who's 78 years old, passed away from lung cancer. It is in Brazilian law that prisoners can go to a family funeral. There's every precedent for it. So Lula petitioned to go to the funeral, was refused. In the 1980s, when his mother died, the military junta that was in charge of Brazil at that time allowed Lula, a young labor leader leading the movement against them, to go to his mother's funeral. The Bolsonaro regime, with the full backing of the U.S. corporate sector, would not allow him to go. They've literally started saying, in their own words, he's not like other prisoners, which sounds like, I guess we're going to start being honest, that this is a political prisoner that you're terrified of and you want to torture and make suffer. They ended up offering him to see his brother and family briefly at a military base. Lula, as far as I understand, refused because it was a calumny. And speaking, of course, to his courage. I want to play this clip briefly. This is a throwback clip that we do usually in the postgame. This is an interview from 2010. Lula is still president of Brazil. This is a talk to Al Jazeera, and it's a simple clip. But again, it underlines the fact that this guy, who should get a Nobel Prize for taking 40 million people out of poverty and eliminating hunger in Brazil, hunger that has reasserted itself in Brazil because of the austerity of the Michel Temer government, will only get worse under the Wall Street fascist Bolsonaro government. But this is Lula just talking about his background and how he governed for the poor. Again, look, this is social democratic stuff. And this was the furthest most reach of what was available in the world in 2002. And this guy is a political prisoner, and it is a obscenity that every single person should speak on, and politicians from AOC to Ilhan Omar and everybody else better get on.
You come from a poor background, that you left school at 5th grade to help support your family, and that you clean the shoes of men who are richer than you as a child. How much did these experiences as a boy shape the man who went on to become president?
Eu penso que a minha personalidade.
I believe I owe my personality to an education that I received at home from my mother, and I believe that my life experience forged the conception that I have today of the President of the Republic. Although I have the consciousness that I am the president of 190 million Brazilians, I also have the consciousness that as the head of state, I have to give priority to the poorest, to those that are more in want, those people that need the state more. That is to say that with a little bit of money, you can help a lot of poor people. And sometimes with a lot of money, you don't manage to satisfy someone that is very rich. So it's a question of definition. And I was raised like that. And then I learned in the trade unions, and I try in the presidency, I tried to portray a little bit of what I had in my life experience.
And just to follow up on that, this is a piece by Fernando Horta in Brazil Wire, which of course Brian Mayer and everyone else there is the indispensable resource on all things Brazil. I'm going to quote now from Horta. The reason Lula was jailed now, this was written several months ago. The reason Lula was jailed now before the elections was that he was going to win them. And then perhaps Brazil would have had a future again. A little bit more. Lula's crime was raising the minimum salary, transforming Brazil into the world's 5th largest economy, and not mincing his words with the U.S. or Bolivia. Lula's crime was to bring water to the Northeast, to transform Brazil into a country which had a future. Lula was imprisoned because he was democratically unbeatable. And that's the bottom line. And it's an absolute obscenity that obviously I and we will continue to speak on, and we all must speak on. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. We've got a bunch of clips to play you. We've got to talk about this awesome new Bernie Sanders proposal on a wealth tax coming out. Excellent piece of legislation from Bernard. Also some pretty cool clips of his that are coming around. I guess he's got like a new comms director on Twitter that's posting some awesome stuff he did in the 80s. I had a crazy appearance on Israeli television. Actually, I mean, I was polished and smooth, but the guy I was talking to was crazy. Host was interesting. A bunch of other clips. Take your Discord questions. We'll see if we'll get to some calls. We're going to be pretty tight because we actually, as soon as this is over, we're going to go and do some of our final run-through for the live show tomorrow. You can check at the Bell House. There might be some tickets left. Go check it out. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Spread the word. If you're new here, welcome. Know we've gotten a bunch of new subscribers. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Forrest. Thank you to all patrons. Peace and love. Left is best.